The early morning sun filtered through the trees, spilling soft gold across a quiet suburban street where everything looked perfect from the outside. But inside, something was brewing that would soon divide the entire neighborhood. The camera slowly pushes in on a modest two-story brick house where Marcus Williams, a 43-year-old black father of two, knelt beside his beloved hedge garden, trimming the green edges with careful precision. These hedges weren't just plants to Marcus, they were his sanctuary, his pride, and the result of years of patient work. He had planted them when he and his wife first bought this house 10 years ago, watching them grow season after season, shaping them into a living wall of privacy and peace. But that peace didn't last long. A sharp voice broke the stillness. "Marcus, those hedges are way too high again," said Karen, a middle-aged HOA board member with a clipboard in hand and a scowl fixed permanently on her face. She stood at the edge of his driveway like she owned the block, her perfectly ironed khaki shorts and crisp white blouse making her look like she was headed to an HOA photo shoot rather than a confrontation. Marcus didn't even look up at first. He'd heard this before, too many times. "Morning, Karen," he said calmly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "The hedges are within regulation height. I measured them myself last week." Karen crossed her arms, glaring. "They don't look within regulation. And several neighbors have complained that they're blocking the view from the street. It's a safety concern." Marcus finally met her eyes, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Funny how those neighbors never complain to me directly. And I checked the HOA bylaws. I'm not violating anything." Karen's lips curved into the kind of smile people wear when they've already decided they're right, no matter what the facts say. "Well, we'll just see about that at the next board meeting." She scribbled something on her clipboard and walked away without another word. Marcus watched her go, shaking his head, feeling that old knot of anger forming in his chest. He'd worked hard to get here. Years of double shifts, saving every extra dollar, overcoming barriers that people like Karen never had to face. And now, instead of enjoying the home he had earned, he found himself constantly defending his right to make it his own. It wasn't just the hedges. It was the parking violations she invented, the noise complaints whenever his kids played basketball in the driveway, the passive-aggressive notes about maintaining the community's character. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Karen and the HOA board weren't trying to keep the neighborhood beautiful. They were trying to keep Marcus in his place. He didn't want to believe it at first. He wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, to assume it wasn't personal. But late-night whispers with his wife, Keisha, told him otherwise. "She's targeting you, Marcus," Keisha said softly one night as they sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out between them. "I've seen the way she talks to the other families. It's not the same. She smiles at them, jokes with them. But with us," her voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them. Marcus sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I know. But if I fight back, they'll just come harder. I have to be smart about this." He didn't know it yet, but the fight was coming whether he wanted it or not, because while Marcus was trying to hold on to his peace, Karen was about to make a move that would shatter it completely. A move so bold, so invasive, that it would force Marcus to choose between backing down or building something stronger, something permanent, something that would change the neighborhood forever. The tension had been simmering for weeks after Karen's warning, but Marcus thought if he kept his head down and stuck to the rules, things would eventually settle. He measured the hedges twice, even lowered them by an extra 2 inches just to avoid conflict. He stayed polite, kept his yard immaculate, and avoided any unnecessary interactions with the HOA board. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before something else sparked the next confrontation. That moment came one warm Saturday morning. Marcus was in the garage, fixing his son's bike, when his daughter came running in, breathless and panicked. "Daddy! Daddy! There's a truck outside! They're cutting the bushes!" Marcus froze, wrench in hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to the driveway, where he saw a landscaping crew hired by the HOA, hacking away at the hedges he'd spent years growing and shaping. Pieces of green foliage were strewn across the lawn like confetti, and the once thick wall of privacy was disappearing by the second. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" Marcus shouted, running toward them. One of the workers, looking uncomfortable, paused for a moment before replying. "Sir, we're just following orders." OA board said these hedges were in violation. Marcus turned sharply, scanning the street, and there she was, Karen, standing on the sidewalk, arms folded, watching with an expression that could only be described as smug satisfaction. "You can't just come onto my property and destroy my hedges!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Karen's tone was cool and dismissive. Actually, we can. Section 14 of the HOA Covenant gives us authority to maintain community standards when a homeowner refuses to comply. You had your chance, Marcus? I did comply, he roared, stepping closer, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. I measured them. I trimmed them. I followed your damn rules. Karen's expression didn't change. They were still obstructing the line of sight from the street. We're thinking about safety here, Marcus. You should be thanking us. That last line hit him like a slap. Thanking her. For tearing down something he built with his own hands. For stripping away the little sanctuary he'd created for his family. He could feel his blood boiling. But he forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to keep control in front of his kids, who had now joined him on the driveway, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Get them off my property, he said finally, his voice low and steady, every word measured. Karen hesitated for a moment, then signaled to the crew to stop. But the damage was already done. Half the hedges were gone, leaving behind jagged stumps where lush green walls once stood. Marcus stood there in silence, his jaw tight, watching as the workers packed up their tools and drove away. Karen gave him one last glance before turning and walking back toward her pristine white SUV. Inside the house, Keisha wrapped her arms around him as soon as he stepped inside. Marcus, I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. He shook his head, staring blankly out the window. This isn't about Hedges anymore, he said quietly. This is about control, about respect. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, scrolling through HOA bylaws, property codes, and legal forums on his laptop. He read every clause, every regulation, every exception, and as he pieced the puzzle together, something shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let this stand. Not anymore. Karen thought she'd broken him, but what she didn't realize was that she'd awakened something much stronger, his determination to fight back. Not with anger, but with strategy. He wasn't just going to rebuild what she destroyed. He was going to make sure she could never touch his property again. And that's when the idea struck him. A solution so bold, so unshakable, that it would change everything. The hedges were gone, but Marcus was about to build something Karen couldn't touch. Something made of stone, concrete, and defiance. Something permanent. The following week, Marcus woke up with a fire in his chest and a plan forming in his mind. Every time he stepped outside and saw the jagged, uneven stumps where his lush hedges once stood, the anger rose again, but this time it wasn't a reckless anger. It was focused, calculated. Karen thought she had won. She thought cutting down his hedges would humiliate him, would remind him of who's in charge in this neighborhood. But she underestimated Marcus, and more importantly, she underestimated his resolve. He spent days researching property rights and consulting with a friend who worked in construction law. That's when he discovered something buried deep in the HOA documents that most people would have overlooked. While the HOA had some authority over landscaping, they had no legal control over permanent structures, as long as they were built within his property lines and up to city code. That single detail changed everything. By Thursday, Marcus had drawn up rough sketches of his new plan, a full cinder block wall around the perimeter of his front yard, 6 feet high, solid, unbreakable, and completely HOA-proof. He smiled for the first time in days. They could cut hedges, but they couldn't cut stone. That weekend, he rented a truck, bought pallets of gray cinder blocks, cement, gravel, and tools. As he unloaded them into his driveway, he noticed Karen watching from across the street, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pinched with suspicion. She finally couldn't hold back and walked over. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Marcus?" she asked, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension. He turned to her, leaning against the truck with an easy calm she clearly wasn't expecting. "Building a wall," he said simply. "You can't just put up a wall without HOA approval," she snapped. Marcus pulled a folded stack of papers from his pocket and handed them to her. "Actually," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "I can. Section 9, paragraph 3. Permanent structures within property boundaries don't require HOA consent as long as they meet city code. I checked with the city inspector yesterday. Everything's approved." Karen's jaw tightened as she skimmed the papers. This isn't in the spirit of the neighborhood's aesthetic," she said, trying to find ground to stand on. Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes locked on hers. "Funny. I don't remember neighborhood aesthetic being a legal term." Without another word, she shoved the papers back at him and stormed away, muttering under her breath. The next morning, Marcus got to work. It was grueling, mixing concrete, laying the blocks one by one, leveling every row perfectly. But it was also liberating. Each thud of a block hitting the mortar felt like taking back control, like reclaiming his space, his dignity, and his right to peace. Neighbors started noticing. At first, they slowed their cars, curious, whispering to each other as they drove past. Then a few stopped to ask what he was doing. Marcus explained briefly, and one by one, people started nodding, even offering to help. By the second weekend, two of his neighbors, an older retired couple from across the street and a young family down the block, were mixing cement alongside him, handing him blocks, and measuring levels. It became a community effort, one fueled not just by construction but by quiet resistance. Karen hated every minute of it. She called emergency HOA meetings, sent out mass emails about unsanctioned changes to neighborhood appearance, and even threatened fines. But Marcus was prepared. Every time she tried to challenge him, he replied with documents, codes, and legal precedents she couldn't touch. She was used to intimidation working. This time, it didn't. By the end of the third weekend, the wall stood tall, smooth, sturdy, and impossible to ignore. For the first time since the hedges were cut, Marcus felt like he could breathe again. He ran his hand along the cool surface of the blocks, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. This wasn't just a wall of concrete. It was a wall of defiance, a wall that said, "You don't get to control me." From her front yard, Karen glared at it like it was a personal insult. In a way, it was. But to Marcus, it was more than that. It was protection, security, and most of all, freedom. Little did she know, though, the battle wasn't over. Because Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. She had one more card up her sleeve, and Marcus was ready for whatever came next. The wall was finished, but the war was far from over. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to enjoy the quiet, the kind of quiet he hadn't felt since the hedges were destroyed. His kids played in the yard without feeling watched. Keisha sipped coffee on the porch without worrying about Karen's constant inspections. And Marcus himself finally slept through the night without replaying that awful day when the landscapers came. But peace doesn't sit well with people like Karen. 3 days after the wall was complete, Marcus received a thick envelope from the HOA stuffed with official-looking papers. Bold letters screamed, "Nati Ofeolation," across the top. They accused him of obstructing neighborhood visibility, reducing community aesthetic value, and creating an unapproved structure. At the bottom, in red ink, it stated that if the wall wasn't removed within 30 days, he'd face fines of $250 per day until it was gone. Keisha found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, his jaw tight. "They're really doing this?" she said quietly, scanning the papers over his shoulder. "They don't have a case," Marcus muttered. "I checked everything. I spoke to the city inspector. This wall is legal?" Keisha placed her hand on his. "Then what are we going to do? Fight?" he said simply, his voice low but firm. And fight they did. Marcus called the HOA's bluff and hired an attorney, gathering every document he'd collected over the past month. Property deeds, building permits, zoning approvals, and even screenshots of OA bylaws. The attorney's first move was to file a cease and desist against the HOA, demanding they retract their violation notice or face legal action for harassment. Karen was furious. At the next HOA meeting, which Marcus attended for the first time in months, she unleashed her frustration in front of everyone. "This wall sets a dangerous precedent," she snapped, slamming her folder shut. "If we let him keep it, what's next? Barbed wire fences? Neon paint. We have rules for a reason." Marcus stood slowly, every eye in the room on him. His voice was calm, but carried enough weight to silence the whispers. "I followed your rules. You cut down my hedges without cause, and I didn't retaliate. I read every regulation, every code. I built something within my rights. And now you want to fine me because you don't like the way it looks. That's not about rules, that's about control." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, someone had called Karen out publicly. By the following week, word had spread through the neighborhood. Some homeowners started quietly voicing their support for Marcus. They were tired of the nitpicking fines, the invasive inspections, and the constant power struggles. What started as a battle over one man's hedges had become a larger fight about fairness, property rights, and dignity. Eventually, faced with mounting pushback and a looming lawsuit, the HOA backed down. The fines were withdrawn, the violation notice rescinded, and Marcus got to keep his wall exactly as it was. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the orange light washed over the freshly built blocks, Marcus stood in the driveway, leaning against the wall he'd fought so hard for. His kids ran circles around the yard, laughing freely, while Keisha sat on the porch with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. Karen walked past on the opposite side of the street, her pace brisk, her head down. She didn't speak, didn't glare, didn't even glance his way. For the first time since he'd moved into the neighborhood, she had nothing left to say. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the moment settle over him. This wasn't just about Hedges, or a wall, or even an HOA. It was about standing up when someone tries to strip away your peace, your dignity, and your right to exist without constant scrutiny. The wall didn't just protect his yard. It became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the only way to be heard is to build something they can't tear down. But Marcus also knew something else. This wasn't just his story. Across the country, homeowners like him were fighting the same battles. Against overreaching HOAs, against bias, against people who thought their power gave them the right to dictate how others lived. His victory was personal, yes, but it was also proof that resilience, preparation, and standing your ground could change the game. That night, sitting on the porch with Keisha, he looked out at the solid wall, its shadow stretching into the yard, and whispered, "They thought they broke me, but they just helped me build stronger." And for the first time since the fight began, Marcus felt free.